They dressed me in white as if I were a bride, but I knew the gown was meant for dirt, not for love. The fabric clung cold against my skin, stiff with ritual salt and the smell of mothballs, and though the women of the city whispered prayers while painting my face pale, I could hear the muffled laughter of men outside preparing the coffin. They called it honor, this choosing, this sacrifice, this yearly spectacle meant to please the curse that gripped our city like a clenched fist, but I knew better. I was not chosen because of destiny or gods. I was chosen because the council of elders needed someone weak enough to bury and silent enough to forget, and in their minds I was both. Yet as I stood on that raised platform in the plaza, candles burning like hollow eyes around me, I felt something coil inside me like a serpent waking, fear, yes, but something sharper underneath. The crowd cheered as they pressed the chalice to my lips, a bitter draught of herbs meant to blur the edges of the night, to still the heart into a compliant drum. I drank because refusal meant knives, not mercy. My vision swam, lanterns stretching into streaks, faces melting into masks of cruelty, and the sound of drums rose like a funeral march disguised as music. Hands guided me, forced me, carried me toward the black mouth of the coffin, polished wood gleaming with the oils of generations, carved with symbols I never cared to learn. They laid me inside as if tucking in a child, but I clenched my teeth against their muttered blessings, their false tenderness, for I could feel the nails biting into my palms. When the lid shut, the world became wood, breath, and heartbeat, a small universe of darkness that seemed to press against my skin like a second burial. I heard them chanting above, earth shovels biting, soil raining down, the last scraps of sky sealing away. The weight came quickly, each handful of earth a fist slamming against my chest. My breaths grew shallow, drugged lungs struggling, panic clawing its way into me like an animal. I beat my fists against the coffin, felt splinters slice my knuckles. But the noise was nothing against the roar of the crowd, the stomping of feet, the celebration of my death. The funeral was not mourning, it was theater, blood sport disguised as tradition. I could picture them above, children perched on their fathers' shoulders, vendors selling wine, young couples kissing as if this burial were a wedding, not a murder. My body wanted to give in, to let the drug and the dirt lull me into the silence they demanded, but the serpent inside me coiled tighter, hissing louder. No, it said, not yet, not here. I remembered my mother's face, though blurred now by years of distance. She too had been chosen, when I was barely a girl, and I had watched her dragged in white lace through these same streets. They had promised she would become a spirit guardian, that her sacrifice would keep the city safe. Instead, her body rotted under soil, and I became an orphan fed on scraps of pity. As the soil pressed against me now, I realized I was her echo, her shadow reborn, and I felt rage seep into me like a second bloodstream. The curse was not a ghost in the hills or a demon in the rivers. The curse was the people themselves, the cheering crowd, the council who had made death a holiday. And I swore then, beneath layers of wood and dirt, that if there were any path back to breath, I would make their curse my weapon, their tradition my undoing. My fingers found weakness in the coffin seam, small cracks swollen by damp. I clawed until nails tore and bled, until skin peeled back and bone bit into wood. My arms screamed, lungs spasmed, but still I scraped, pushed, forced space into being. Dirt trickled in, cold and wet against my mouth, and instinct should have made me recoil, but I bit into it, spat, swallowed grit if it meant air could slip through. Somewhere above, the drums had ended, replaced by music and laughter, and I felt hatred burn brighter than fear. They were already celebrating me as a ghost, not knowing I was still moving, still clawing, still cursing their names one by one. The first crack gave way with a sound like bone snapping. A sliver of earth spilled through, choking, heavy, but it was freedom too. I shoved with everything I had, body twisting, legs kicking against the coffin walls until my shoulder screamed out of socket. Wood cracked again, a groan like a dying animal, and suddenly the lid split, a jagged line of night air rushing down like a gasp from the heavens. I clawed, dug, dragged myself upward through collapsing soil, each handful of dirt fighting to drag me back. My chest burned, vision swam, but the serpent within me guided, fueled, pulled. And then my hand broke through the surface, pale fingers clawing at moonlight, nails black with blood and soil. When my head breached the earth, I vomited dirt, gasped air so sharp it cut my throat raw. Around me, the plaza was empty now, torches guttering low, banners fluttering over abandoned wine cups and ashes of candles. They had left me to rot beneath their feast, their laughter still echoing faintly in alleys beyond. I dragged myself fully from the grave, a corpse reborn, white gown shredded, hair clotted with soil and blood. I stood swaying, trembling, every nerve aflame, but alive, terribly alive, and in that ragged breath I knew something sacred and profane. I had cheated their funeral. I had clawed out from the belly of their tradition. And for that, they would pay. I staggered through the plaza, the silence thick with the ghosts of their cheers. The city had already returned to its beds, its laughter still dripping from the stone walls like old blood, but I could feel the echo of my burial in every corner. My bare feet slapped against the cobblestones, leaving trails of dirt and red, my dress a ruined shroud that dragged like the tail of some revenant beast. I moved not as the girl they had chosen but as something else entirely, something pulled from the soil with rage in its lungs and a coffin's splinters in its fists. The night smelled of ash, rot, and cheap wine, and in that reek I promised myself that none of them, not one, would escape the harvest I had become. I found the first man in an alley behind the butcher's stalls, pissed drunk and humming the same funeral hymn they had played as they buried me. He never even looked up before my hands were on him, nails raking his throat, my teeth snapping at his ear as he screamed. I felt no hesitation, no pause for mercy. The serpent in me guided my fingers, drove them deep into his eyes until the song stopped and his body sagged heavy against me. I dragged him into the refuse pile and left him there, a gift for the rats, a message for anyone who dared stumble drunk beneath the moon. The funeral would no longer be their joy, it would be their curse, their nightmare, and I would be its keeper. The streets of the city twisted like veins, each turn pulsing with memory of hands that had clapped as I suffocated. I remembered faces in the crowd, the butcher's wife clutching her child as if my death were entertainment. The priest raising his hands in blessing while sweat glistened on his upper lip, the elders standing like vultures draped in robes heavy with stolen gold. Their names carved themselves into my bones, a ledger of blood that demanded balance. Each step I took, I muttered their names under my breath like prayers, but these were no prayers for salvation, they were summons for judgment, invocations of ruin. My voice cracked, low and ragged, but it carried through the empty alleys as if the stones themselves wanted to hear. At the edge of the plaza I found the pit where they had buried me, still fresh, still damp, a gaping wound in the earth half collapsed from my escape. I knelt at its edge, hands trembling, and dug until I found what I needed, the coffin lid, splintered and sharp, edges jagged as teeth. I pulled free a long shard, a weapon born of my own grave, and held it until my hands bled anew. This would be my knife, my oath, my relic, carved not by smiths or saints but by the violence of survival itself. I pressed it to my lips and whispered the first of many vows, that I would never rest, never falter, never forgive. Dawn threatened at the horizon, but the city's joy was not yet done. From the council hall, I heard voices, laughter still spilling from windows where the elders feasted long after the crowd had dispersed. I crept closer, a shadow against their stone walls, watching through the cracks as they drank and tore meat with their teeth, congratulating themselves for another year kept safe, another sacrifice swallowed. My blood boiled, but I did not rush. The serpent in me hissed patience. I would not waste myself in a blaze too soon. No, I would bleed them slow, one by one, until they choked on their own fear. I would let them feel the dirt pressing against their chests even as they walked in daylight. I would make every sunrise taste like soil in their throats. As the sun lifted, I vanished into the city's veins, into its markets and alleys, into the spaces they thought too small for vengeance to crawl. I hid in the cracks, fed on scraps, healed my broken body with rage alone. Yet even as wounds knit, I kept the gown, the soil, the splinters, a reminder of what I had been forced to endure. People began to whisper, first as rumor, then as dread, the chosen bride still walked, the grave had failed to keep her, the funeral was unfinished. Mothers hushed their children, men carried torches at night, priests muttered longer prayers, and the council sent guards to patrol the cemetery walls. But none of it mattered. For the truth was simple, they had buried me, and I had risen. They had created me, and now I was inevitable. I was no longer woman, no longer victim. I was soil made flesh, vengeance carved from coffin wood, hunger sharpened by every clapping hand that had celebrated my death. The funeral they worshipped was no longer theirs to control. It was mine now, and it would never end. A year passed, but time meant nothing to me anymore. I lived beneath the city like a rat in its own grave, crawling through sewers slick with waste, hiding in abandoned cellars where mold grew thick on the walls, feeding on scraps I stole from market stalls while shadows hid my face. My body healed into something twisted, bones sharper beneath skin, muscles hardened by hunger, eyes hollow yet burning. The white gown rotted into threads, but I kept its tatters as a shroud, proof of what they had done to me, a second skin stitched from dirt and spite. And all the while, I counted the days with scars on the walls, waiting, sharpening the shard of coffin wood until it gleamed with dried blood, whispering to myself of the moment they would gather again. I would let them bury another girl, I swore. I would watch their celebration, and then I would give them back their funeral and screams. When the bells tolled for the next choosing, I climbed from my pit into a world unchanged. The banners hung fresh with paint, the stalls filled with wine and meat, the streets strung with ribbons like veins pulsing for slaughter. Children ran with flowers, men raised cups, women prayed with lowered eyes, and I watched it all from the shadows, a revenant in plain sight. They did not see me at first, not as I drifted through the crowd, hair tangled, skin gray with soil, eyes sharp as knives. To them I was only another beggar, another ghost of poverty haunting their celebration, but I saw them, every face that had laughed while I suffocated, every mouth that had sung as the dirt crushed me, every hand that had thrown soil on my coffin. My ledger had been waiting, and tonight it would open in blood. The chosen girl this year was younger than me, barely more than a child. Her gown was clean, her face painted pale, her lips trembling as they pressed the chalice to her mouth. I watched her swallow, saw the fear clawing in her eyes, and something inside me burned hotter than rage. I could not save her, not now, not yet, but I could avenge her. As they lowered her into the coffin, as the drums rose and the crowd roared, I moved among them like a phantom, unseen yet present, and I marked my first prey. The priest who raised his hand in blessing, the same priest who had blessed my burial, stood fat and satisfied, his lips red with wine. I slid behind him, shard of coffin wood hidden beneath rags, and as he opened his mouth to sing, I drove it up through the softness beneath his chin, silencing his hymn forever. His blood sprayed over candles, and the crowd did not notice at first, too drunk on ritual, too blinded by tradition. When they did see, panic did not bloom immediately, it came slow, rippling like cracks in glass. The priest fell, twitching, his eyes wide in shock, and whispers spread before screams. Some thought it part of the ritual, some thought him struck by the curse, but I knew the truth, and soon they would too. I left his body slumped over the altar, blood pooling into the wine bowls, and I vanished back into the crowd. My heart pounded not with fear but with hunger, a hunger I had carried since the dirt first pressed into my throat. And now that it had tasted release, it demanded more. I found a merchant next, one whose laughter I remembered clearly from the night of my burial. He had stood on a crate, shouting jokes as if death were a carnival, his voice echoing as my coffin closed. Tonight, he stood near his stall, wine dripping from his beard, coins clinking heavy in his purse. I took him in silence, my hands around his throat, dragging him into the shadows of his own tent, where I drove the shard through his chest again and again until it cracked bone. His blood-soaked bolts of silk, his death muffled beneath festival drums, and when his body stilled I whispered in his ear, "The funeral is mine now." Then I left him there, eyes staring blank at the canvas roof, a carcass dressed in finery. The crowd began to notice, fear leaking into their celebration. 2 deaths in moments, 2 men silenced as the chosen girl still suffocated beneath the soil. Women clutched children, men drew knives, guards lit torches, but they could not find me. I was everywhere and nowhere, slipping through alleys, moving with the serpent's patience. I struck again, this time at a guard who had thrown the first shovel of dirt upon me. His torch lit his face clearly in the dark, and I carved it away with my shard, leaving his screams to echo as I melted back into shadow. The torches began to multiply, panic spreading faster now, cries rising above the drums, and I knew the city was tasting its first drop of the terror I had carried for a year. But I did not want only fear, I wanted despair, I wanted collapse, I wanted to turn their sacred funeral into a pit they would never climb out of. So I let them see me at last. I stepped from the shadows into the torchlight, a figure draped in rags and grave dirt, hair matted, face streaked with blood not my own. My eyes burned into theirs, and silence fell heavy before screams broke it open. Mothers pulled children away, men stumbled back, guards shouted commands, but none dared move closer. They knew me. They recognized what had clawed out of the grave. And in that instant, the celebration shattered, the funeral ended not with joy but with terror. They found the chosen girl later, her small body bruised and cold where the coffin had suffocated most of the breath from her lungs. She was not the bright pale paper doll they had dressed at dawn but a husk, eyes half-rolling, lips blue, and when the crowd finally rolled back into the plaza with torches and priests and frantic questions, they saw what their festival produced, a child almost dead and the stains of joy still wet on the stones. Some reached for her and sobbed as if awakening to a truth they had refused for years, some turned away with the practiced neatness of those who keep bargains with blood. I watched at the edge of the circle while the healers fussed and the council bickered about omens, and the thing inside me loosened like a coiled spring, not satisfaction, not redemption, but a cold, clean calculation. The city had to learn that their rights were not sacred, they were transactions where human lives balanced ledgers. If one audience wanted a spectacle, then their spectacle would be a mirror. The council convened in panic behind carved doors, their robes smelling now of fear more than incense. They debated loudly, fingers pointing, voices rising in the way of men who could not imagine consequences because they had always paid to avoid them. Some wanted to call for a purge of the streets, to have armed men sweep alleys and display bodies as a warning. Others whispered of offering larger sacrifices, of doubling the price of safety with more women and tighter vows. Their language was the language of preservation, sacrifice, containment, control. It disgusted me to listen. They had taught generations how to make murder respectable, now their own respectability began to crumble into dirt. A plan formed in my head not from fury alone but from a map of their arrogance. I would make them choose in front of the city which they preferred, the comforts of power or the reality of what power demands. That night I struck again under the guise of chaos. I let the city see confusion and then I shaped it into narrative. We toppled banners, released pigeons that had been fed with bits of sacrificial bread, and scattered pamphlets that laid out names, lists of donors and their gifts, with dates and addresses. I let the crowd find the evidence themselves. The act of finding is a violence more intimate than any blade because it forces the witness to become the judge. Mothers held papers and read aloud, their voices breaking into the open, and with each name spoken the council's fabric thinned. Men who had once sat in velvet chairs found themselves refused at markets, the watchful neighbors forced them from streets with cries of accusation. Their houses, once sanctuaries, filled with reporters banging at shutters, and their children were asked at school why their father's name appeared beside a ledger of girls. Shame is its own torture, slow, public, corrosive, and I administered it with the care of a surgeon. They retaliated by trying to catch me in the act, by setting traps and posting men with torches in alleys, but we had anticipated greed's predictability. Juno had taught a dozen working hands how to slip through a cordon, Marisol had learned which guards took bribes and how to mark them subtly so they'd be exposed later. We moved like oil through cracked streets, invisible until the first body was found, messy and inexplicable. The council made mistakes out of their need to respond with force, and each mistake widened the public's eyes. One magistrate, frantic to show control, ordered a mass arrest and the cameras caught his own ledger tucked into a Bible on his desk, a ledger that named donors and auctions. The footage ran all night, the man's resignation came at dawn. Their panic fed the narrative we had built. The festival was not protection, it was the economy of abuse, and the people now had receipts. As speakers called for reason, reason no longer soothed, it exposed. Town squares filled with debates that resembled trials, and the judges who had once deferred to the elders now stood with papers and evidence and asked uncomfortable questions about what a sacrifice really dressed up. The church tried to salvage authority by publishing statements about the sanctity of tradition, but the statements read as if written by men who had suddenly discovered conscience in an emergency. That the clergy scrambled only painted them complicit, that they moved to parry rather than confront made the crowd more certain that the rituals had always been a performance for profit. The city began to fracture into camps, those who clung to order and those who said order had been the predator all along. Violence on streets shifted from ritual to reaction, and in the space of that shift I watched the map of power redraw itself. In the end, I never sought to be a god. I sought only to ensure the truth lived in sunlight. But the truth does not make clean things, it makes real things, and reality can be cruel. The chosen girl did not survive fully, she lingered in hospital rooms like a shadow of the spectacle, a living indictment that would haunt the council longer than any corpse. Mothers came to sit by her bed and press their palms to the metal rails, whispering names like prayers to the living who had been almost taken. Their grief became armor. Their presence in hospitals and markets became a living memory that the elders could not erase with proclamations. The funeral that once chewed on the living had birthed a witness who could not be buried again, and witnesses ate at the foundations of corrupt rites. By dawn, the city was changed. Shops opened reluctantly, Conversations hummed with fear and with newfound courage, and the council's meetings became secretive affairs with fewer chairs and colder wine. They sent emissaries to soothe and to bribe, but their offers fell like coins into a well, hollow, useless. The people had tasted culpability and recoil. Some wanted immediate retribution, others argued for legal processes, but most only wanted to stop the bleeding. I watched the plaza where they had tried to bury me as families lingered there, some laying flowers, others simply standing and staring as if remembering they had been taught wrong. I slipped away then, not because the work was done, it never would be, but because presence could become myth, and myth becomes a new altar. I had taught a city to look, now I would teach it to remember, and memory demands guardians. When night fell again, I returned to my small den beneath the market and looked at the shard of wood I had pulled from my own coffin, the edge still raw and stained. I held it as if it were a bone and felt the history of the city thrum through my hands. The funeral had become a wound that would not heal, and I had become its fever. There would be more nights of blood, more lists, more names carved into walls and into men, and the council would bargain with every means at their disposal. They had taught generations that secrecy protects them. I had taught a generation that exposure is contagious. The ritual that had been their safety net had torn into them instead, and the city, for the first time, was learning how to hate its own hunger. The city bled for weeks after that night, a wound that no prayer or proclamation could close. The chosen girl lingered in the hospital like a living ghost, and every time someone visited her bed, every time her small lungs rasped in the dark, they were reminded of what the funeral truly was. The council tried to regain control, new banners, fresh sermons, promises of reformed rituals, but their words were brittle as old bone, snapping under the weight of truth. They whispered among themselves in locked chambers, calling me a specter, a demon, a curse given flesh, but none dared admit the greater truth. I was not an invention of some ghostly power. I was their creation, their sin incarnate, and their city was finally seeing it. When the season turned again, when the time for the next funeral drew near, I felt the serpent inside me coil with anticipation. Would they cancel the ritual, break the chain, admit guilt? No. Predictable as rot, they chose spectacle again. They announced with trembling lips that the funeral would continue, but this year it would be holier, safer, guided by divine law. Their trap was obvious: bait another girl, dig another grave, and wait for me to return, thinking I would claw into their circle like a moth to flame. They wanted to end me not with courage but with tradition sharpened into a weapon. But they forgot that I had crawled through soil and silence, that patience had been pressed into me like marrow, and I had learned to use their arrogance as my tool. The chosen girl this time was no child. She was a woman of sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes, and when I saw her, I knew something different pulsed in her veins. They thought her helpless, drugged and docile, but I saw the flicker of rage in her glare, the twitch of fists longing to resist. Perhaps she had lost someone to a past funeral, perhaps she had only been chosen for her silence, but I knew immediately she would not die meekly. They lowered her into the coffin while the crowd cheered weakly, voices cracking with unease, but I did not rush to her aid. No. I let them bury her, let them pile the dirt, let them chant their hollow hymns. Because this time, it would not be me crawling from the grave. This time, it would be them. As the last shovelful hit, I moved. Not alone, the city had shifted, its fear now a blade in my hand. Whispers of my deeds had grown into sympathizers, shadows who passed me food, names, and cover. That night they joined me, faces wrapped in cloth, hands gripping makeshift weapons, knives, stones, even sharpened tools. We were no army, but we were something worse, a mob guided by vengeance, by memory, by the raw wound of years. We descended on the plaza not as mourners but as executioners, tearing through guards with silent fury, scattering priests like insects beneath torchlight. I led them straight to the council hall, where the elders waited in their trap, expecting me to strike alone. Instead, they faced the weight of every secret dragged into the open, every name read aloud in shame, every family robbed of a daughter. The council had built the funeral to control fear, to feed the city's terror into obedience. But tonight, terror belonged to them. We stormed their chamber, shattered their polished doors, dragged them from velvet chairs. They shouted for order, for law, for the gods they had twisted into excuses, but no one listened. I made them kneel on the plaza stones where they had made me kneel a year before, their robes soiled, their jewels clattering uselessly on the ground. And then I gave them the same chalice they had pressed to my lips, the same bitter draught meant to still the body, blur the mind. They refused, spitting, cursing, but my hands were iron now, and with the help of others, we forced it down their throats. The crowd that gathered did not cheer this time. They watched in silence, breathless, as justice bent tradition into something new, something raw, something merciless. When the council fell into stupors, we dug graves, not in the hidden cemetery, not in silence, but in the heart of the plaza where all could see. We built coffins from their own banquet tables, lined with their banners, and one by one, we lowered them down. Their muffled screams rose as dirt struck the lids, their fists pounded as if they were the victims now, but I knew and the people knew, they were only reaping what they had sown for generations. The funeral had not ended, it had turned, inverted, rewritten itself with them as the offering. And as the last shovel struck, I looked out at the crowd, their faces pale with shock and awe, and I whispered loud enough for all to hear, "The funeral never ends." The city did not sleep that night. Fires burned in alleyways, bells tolled without order, and mothers clutched their children as if death itself were stalking every corner. Some whispered that by turning the funeral upon its masters, I had broken the curse. Others whispered louder, that I had not broken anything, only twisted it further. Because when dawn came, and the crowd gathered again to see if the council would rise, the ground remained silent. Coffins held their secrets, muffled cries growing weaker with each hour, and though many prayed, no divine hand came to lift the dirt. The funeral had devoured its creators, and yet its hunger was not satisfied. In the days that followed, unease curdled into paranoia. Every knock on a door, every shuffle in the street at night, they thought it was me. And sometimes, it was. I wandered the city openly now, scarred face unhidden, and no one dared bar my path. But I noticed something stranger. When I walked, others followed. Not out of loyalty, not out of bravery, but out of some magnetic pull, as if vengeance were a sickness passed from one to another. Men and women who had once cheered at my burial now stared at me with haunted eyes, and when I spoke, they listened. I did not ask for disciples, but they gathered all the same. And with them, the funeral spread like rot, seeping into every crack of the city's foundation. Soon, it was no longer just the council who was buried. Thieves caught stealing were dragged into boxes and covered in dirt. Betrayers, liars, debtors, all were lowered into shallow graves, given a taste of the silence that had once been mine. Some I ordered, some I did not. It no longer mattered. The funeral had become a language, a sentence, a cycle that no one could stop. Even those who once opposed me began using it, whispering that the ground will judge, shoving their rivals beneath the soil. And I realized, standing in the square one evening as a dozen coffins were being filled, that I had not destroyed the ritual. I had become it. They painted me as a revenant, a saint of dirt and blood, a woman who rose from her grave to balance the scales. But saints heal, and revenants fade. I did neither. I endured. And with each passing month, I shed more of the softness of flesh and memory, until only the iron of purpose remained. I no longer dreamed of the night I was buried, because I relived it every time someone else gasped for breath beneath a lid, every time muffled fists struck wood. Their terror fed me, not like food, not like drink, but like a fire feeds upon air. Endless, consuming, merciless. The final revelation came one winter's night, when a child tugged at my dress as I passed, eyes wide, lips trembling. She asked me if the funeral would ever stop. I stared into her face, soft and unscarred, and for a fleeting second, something human stirred in me. But when I opened my mouth, no comfort came. Only truth. No, it never ends. She fled into the dark, sobbing, but I knew her tears would dry into something sharper. She would grow, and one day, she too might lower someone into a grave, whispering my words like scripture. The funeral had escaped me, had escaped them all. It was no longer an event, it was the city's pulse, its heartbeat, forever echoing with dirt striking wood. Now, years have passed. The council is long rotted, the plaza is more graveyard than square, and the city breathes through fear alone. Travelers who come speak of a cursed place where no death is natural, where every wrong ends in burial, where vengeance walks in human skin. They do not stay long, and those who do vanish beneath the soil. And I remain, scarred, unyielding, eternal, wandering the streets like a shadow stitched to the earth itself. Sometimes I wonder if I am still alive, or if the first night I clawed through the dirt, I truly died and what rose was only vengeance given form. It does not matter now. I am not a woman anymore. I am not flesh, nor ghost. I am the funeral, and the funeral never ends.